This tutorial is meant to orient you to the SBL Handbook of Style, the second edition. And I'm going to try to show you how to use it for writing papers in college classes. There are parts of the Handbook of Style that are unnecessary for you to use for college level work, and there's other parts that you will use and consult regularly. And so I want to help orient you to which parts those are and show you how to use them. So good news, if you go to the table of contents and scroll through the table of contents, you'll see that there are several different chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, lots of different chapters here, most of which you can ignore for college level work. You don't need to worry about chapters 1 through 3. You don't need to worry about chapter 5. There's not going to be a lot of transliterating or transcribing of ancient texts that you're going to do for undergraduate courses. And you also can skip chapter 7. Which again is a section that you don't need because you're not probably going to be using indices in papers that you write for college level work. So that's several chapters that you can skip. That's the good news. The bad news is that's only 35 pages of material. So the chapters that you will need to use, chapters 4, chapters 6, and 8, comprise the bulk of the book. And so let's look and see what are in those chapters. Chapter 4 is a chapter that shows you, that offers some general style guidelines. And so you can scroll through the lengthy table of contents at the beginning of the chapter to see what exactly is there. And this is a good place to note that the SBL Handbook of Style is meant to be a reference work. And so helpfully at the beginning of each chapter you get these detailed tables of contents, and so you can scroll through and see what find the exact section that you need. You do not need to read through the Handbook of Style from cover to cover. Instead, if you have a question about commas, you scroll through the section on general style, find the section on commas, and you can go straight there and look at what you need. So this is a chapter that I would recommend that you skim through and kind of note some things that you'll need to keep in mind when it comes to the style of your writing when you're writing papers for biblical studies. I might call your attention especially to a couple of sections. First of all, section 4.1.6. I'm going to jump to this section here in my PDF. This is a section that addresses possessives. I highlight this because it's a little bit different than you might expect. What recommends is that if you have a singular noun that ends in S, you should still offer the apostrophe S at the end rather than a simple apostrophe if you want to make that possessive. And so you see the example here of Lazarus's home. Where this comes up, of course, most often if you're working in the New Testament is with Jesus' own name. And so you should, to make Jesus a possessive, you actually add the apostrophe S at the end. So I highlight that one because that is a little bit different maybe than what you're used to. And then the other thing I want to look at is in section 4.3.6. And this is a section on capitalization and spelling. And so you come across a lot of words when you're writing in biblical studies that you may not know how to spell, and you may wonder how it's supposed to be capitalized. And so they don't list obviously every word, but they list a lot of words that you might encounter, and so you can go and see what you should do when it comes to capitalization. With us, for example, if we're writing about one of the letters that Paul writes, you might be wondering, do I capitalize letter when I'm talking about the letter to the Philippians or something like that? And so I could scroll here until I got to the section, in this case maybe look under F and see if or L rather, and see if I can see where it talks about letters. And you can see that it does say letter to the Galatians. It recommends capitalizing the L and speaking of it as an actual proper noun. So that's an example of a question you might have and how you'd find it scrolling through chapter 4. So again, just skim through chapter 4 and note some of the things that you'll find there. But if you ever have any questions about style, that's where you're going to find it there in chapter 4, writing style. The other chapters you're going to need to know are chapter 6 and chapter 8. So let's spend a little bit of time with chapter 6. For chapter 6, this is where you're going to find paradigms for how to cite sources both in your footnotes and in your bibliographies. And so again, you can see here in the table of contents at the beginning, where it starts to list specific books, specific types of source. So if you know you have just a book by any single author, right, go to 6.2.1 and you'll see exactly how to do that. If you want to know how to cite an article that's in an edited volume, right, go to 6.2.12 and you can find examples of how to do that. So this is a chapter you will use often. And a lot of what you'll do is you'll come to the SBL Handbook with a certain type of source, and you'll look up here in chapter 6 how it is that you should cite that source. Wouldn't hurt to kind of skim through and familiarize yourself with what types of sources are here, but for the most part, you can wait till you have those sources and you can look up and get the information that you need. I might highlight a couple of sections that come a little bit earlier here that you'll want to look at. One would be just the simple sequence of information. So in 6.1.1, it's going to show you in a typical entry what order does the information come in. All right, and so if I jump ahead to 6.1.1, all right, you can see here that in an entry, this is the order of information. And so if you're trying to build a bibliography entry or a footnote, you might wonder, for example, do I put the edition before or after a volume number? Well, here, right, it tells you that the edition is going to come first before the volume number if you've got both of those things that you need to cite with a particular source. So that's helpful just to have that general sequence of information that might help you decide what to do if it's not completely clear in the paradigms that are provided. Another section that you might check here at the beginning is in 6.1.4. So let me go there. And this is where it gives you names of different presses. I mention this because one of the things that you'll need to do in your bibliography and footnote citations is normally shorten the name of the publisher and maybe even shorten the city that's included in. And so, for example, here they tell you that you should use Brill rather than EJ Brill, or use Eerdmans rather than WM.BM Eerdmans. So how do you know how to shorten these publishers' names and what that should look like? Well, what you'll need to do is you can look here, right, and it just lists all of the typical publishers that you're going to find in biblical studies. It's not a complete list, so you will come across publishers that aren't here, but this gives you a general rule. In general, you can leave off words like press, company, right, things like that when you're talking about the publisher. And if it's a really well-known city, you can leave off the state. But sometimes you might not know whether it's a well-known city or not, and so you can consult here. And so, for example, if I found a source in the Baylor University Press, right, this is telling me that when I write the publisher's name, I should write it out as Baylor University Press. And when I put the place of publication, I should put Waco, Texas. I should include the state there. And another example would be Baker, right, Baker Academic or Baker Books. So you might have a book that's published by Baker, and it's indicating, depending on which part of Baker, I would either write out Baker Academic or write out Baker Books, and then I would just include Grand Rapids. I would not include the state Michigan when I indicate the place. So that's what's being indicated there to you. The first part is the shortened name of the publisher that you should use, and the second part that unfortunately confusingly is in parentheses is the city, the location, and basically it's telling you whether or not you need to include the state or if you can just include the name of the city by itself. So those are a couple helpful sections right before you get into the other parts, the actual paradigms. But if we want to look at the paradigms, let's jump ahead and I'll show you quickly how to look at those. So I'm going to look here at actually let's go back to look at the first one. I just want to look at a simple book here as a good example. Just to show you what you'll find, and that will help you know how to use this particular information. So when you're looking at the paradigms, it's going to give you 3 different examples. All right? And it's got the first example here is a lengthy one, right? And then you've got a shorter one. Both of these first 2 have numbers before them, so you can see a number 15 here, number 19 here, and that's going to have one more, right? That you can see the indents are a little bit different, and it's not numbered. So let me explain what's here, because it's not exactly clear if you haven't read through the whole book. The first example, the top one, is going to be what a footnote should look like the first time you cite a source. This 15 here is just a random number that are showing you kind of, imagine this was footnote 15, right? So that part's random. But then after that, you can see what the information should look like in the particular source. Author's name, the title of the book in italics comes next, and then in parentheses, and that's different than bibliography entries, but in footnotes, in parentheses, you'd put the place of publication, the name of the publisher, the date of publication, the year of publication, close your parentheses, comma, page number, and then period. So that's what you're getting there. That's the full footnote, and that's what you should use the first time you cite something. The second example is a short footnote, and that's what you'd use if you had already cited that source earlier in your paper. So if I've already cited this source by Talbert, and I'm now citing it for a second or third or fourth time, I can use the short footnote, and that's just the author's last name, a shortened title, and you choose the shortened title. Just make sure it's clear and be consistent with yourself, comma, and page number. And that's all I need for the short footnote. This last example, the one without a number, is an example of what it should look like in a bibliography. And so you can see the indents are going to be different because you have a hanging indent with bibliography entries. And you also notice it's the same information, but there's a couple differences. One, you're using periods in between your elements instead of commas like you use in footnotes. Also, I'm not putting the place and the publisher in parentheses like I am in a footnote. And maybe most notably, I start with the author's last name rather than the author's first name when I'm doing a bibliography entry. So that's what you're going to find here for each of these is long footnote, short footnote, and then a bibliography entry. Most of them will have all three of these. If you come across a paradigm that doesn't include all three, that's because there must be one right around it that they think will give you the information you need. I think that's unfortunate. I wish they provided all three for every example, but sometimes they don't. But if you kind of worked your way through, you should be able to figure that out. So that's what you're going to find in Chapter 6, and that's how to use that. Last thing I want to show you is from Chapter 8, another chapter that you're going to use with some frequency. And that's a chapter that lists the abbreviations that you will need to use and that you will encounter when you're doing work in biblical studies. And so there's different kinds of abbreviations that you're going to encounter, but if you look here through the table of contents, you can see that it'll show you how to abbreviate books of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and it'll show you how to abbreviate other works from the period, other primary sources that you might cite. And so that might be helpful if you're using Philo, for example, and you're wanting to know how to cite a particular source from Philo. You can go to this section. You can find a list of Philo's works with examples of how those should be abbreviated. It's probably more likely that what will happen is you'll come across in an article you're reading or a commentary you're reading, a citation of Philo. And if you wanted to go and find that particular work and read it, you need to know what is this abbreviated title referring to. And again, you could come here to this section, look at the lists of Philo's works, and figure out what the abbreviation that you encountered in your source is pointing to. Then you could go find that work by Philo and read what that source is pointing to. So that might be the way that you'd use it more often. The abbreviations for the books of the Bible is something you'll use a lot in your own writing. Most of them are fairly obvious, but they're not always so. So I would recommend as you're beginning to write in biblical studies, you double check and make sure that you are abbreviating the books of the Bible correctly as you do so. One other thing that I'll highlight here is in the last section, 8.4. You'll see that it includes abbreviations for secondary sources that you'll encounter. Right? When you're citing journals, when you're citing dictionaries, or when you're citing commentary series, you will abbreviate the titles of those things in both your footnotes and in bibliography entries. And so you need to know how to properly abbreviate them. Or again, if you're reading a source and you come across an abbreviation abbreviation for a journal, let's say a commentary is citing a particular journal article, and you look down in the footnotes and you see an abbreviation of a journal name, if you want to go find that source, you're probably going to need to know what is that journal. And so here's a place where you can see what that abbreviation means. And so because you might be going both ways, that is, you might be working with a journal and you need to figure out how to abbreviate it in your own writing, or you might encounter an abbreviation and you need to figure out what that abbreviation means. What they do in 8.4 is they give you the same list twice. Okay, 8.4.1, they alphabetize it by the name of the source, and then they show you what the abbreviation is. In 8.4.2, they alphabetize it by the abbreviation and show you what the full name is. So it's the same items in both these, they're just alphabetized differently depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to figure out what an abbreviation is, or if you're trying to work from a source to be able to know the abbreviation and put that in your own writing. So that, again, if you're working with journals, dictionaries, commentary series, that's where you'll go to find how to abbreviate that material. So that's a quick orientation to the SBL Handbook. Hopefully that helps you figure out how you're going to use it, what sections you're going to use, and will make your use of the handbook more efficient.